Putin has given his response to the proposal for a 30-day ceasefire, which was sent to him by the American delegation after negotiations with Ukraine. As military analyst Scott Ritter points out, it would be extremely naive to assume that Russia would simply accept this proposal without any conditions. Why would they agree to such terms? To understand who really needs this ceasefire, one only has to look at the current battlefield map. Ukraine continues to lose its territories at an alarming rate, and since 2024, the pace of these losses has accelerated 3 to 5 times. This indicates that the initiative is entirely on Russia's side, and it has no reason to make concessions. Ritter also highlights the absurdity of the initial conditions proposed by the Ukrainian delegation. They demanded that the Russian side cease military operations at sea and in the air, precisely in the areas where Ukraine has no advantage. This appears to be an attempt to buy time or at least partially reduce the pressure from Russia. However, as Ritter emphasizes, such conditions make no sense because they ignore the actual situation on the battlefield. Some might argue, Scott, but Ukraine has managed to constrain the Russian fleet in the Black Sea using naval drones. Yes, that is partially true. The British shared their technologies with Ukraine, which allowed them to develop drones that initially did pose problems for the Russian fleet. But even then, what did Ukraine achieve? Nothing significant. These attacks provided only a temporary advantage, which quickly faded. Russian scientists and military experts have long developed dozens of ways to jam the signals of these drones, rendering them practically useless. As Ritter notes, in recent times, news about Ukraine's naval attacks has almost disappeared from the media. And that is no coincidence. Simply put, such attacks have lost their effectiveness. The Russian side has adapted to new threats, and Ukraine can no longer use this tool for pressure. Thus, the proposal for a 30-day ceasefire appears to be more of a desperate attempt by Ukraine and its allies to buy time and regroup. However, as Scott Ritter concludes, Russia has no reason to agree to such terms, especially when it holds a clear advantage on the battlefield. Putin and his team understand that any ceasefire must be mutually beneficial, not one-sided. And unless Ukraine and its allies offer something truly worthwhile, Russia will continue to act in its own interests, strengthening its positions and maintaining control over the situation. Now, let's take a closer look at Ukraine's proposal to halt hostilities in the air. As military analyst Scott Ritter points out, Russia also has a massive advantage in this domain, making such proposals extremely unfavorable for Moscow. The Russian military possesses high-precision missiles, advanced fighter jets, such as the Su-27 and MiG-29, and unique fiber-optic drones that cannot be jammed with standard electronic warfare systems. These technologies have long been used on a large scale and have proven their effectiveness on the battlefield. Ritter emphasizes that despite all efforts and Western support, the Ukrainian side has failed to establish production of similar weaponry. This creates a massive imbalance in capabilities between the two sides. For example, the 10 F-16 fighter jets that the West supplied to Ukraine were presented in the media as something revolutionary, capable of turning the tide of the war. However, as Ritter points out, these aircraft are inferior in performance to Russia's Su-27 and MiG-29. Moreover, their numbers are so insignificant that they cannot have a significant impact on the battlefield. The loud headlines in Western media about the transfer of F-16s create the illusion that Ukraine has received powerful weaponry capable of changing the situation, says Ritter. But in reality, this is nothing more than a propaganda move. I don't see any game changer on the battlefield. Ukraine continues to lose territory, while Russian forces methodically advance. Ritter also highlights that Ukraine and its allies are actively fighting in the media sphere, attempting to create the impression that they are in control of the situation. However, real combat operations paint a completely different picture. Russia is acting on land, in the air, and at sea, utilizing its technological and tactical advantages. Despite all the Western support, Ukraine cannot match Russia militarily. Ukraine and the West are trying to win the war in the information space, Ritter notes. They create flashy headlines, exaggerate the significance of every step they take, but the real results on the battlefield speak for themselves. The Russians are fighting in the real world, not in the media. And until Ukraine can offer something truly substantial, the situation is unlikely to change. Thus, the proposal to halt air combat appears to be an attempt by Ukraine to buy time and reduce pressure from Russia. However, as Scott Ritter concludes, Russia has no reason to agree to such terms, especially when it holds a clear advantage in aerial warfare. Until Ukraine and its allies offer something truly valuable, Russia will continue to act in its own interests, strengthening its positions and maintaining control over the situation on all fronts. On the ground, Ukraine's situation is just as dire compared to the other two domains, though not as catastrophic. One of Ukraine's biggest problems is a severe shortage of personnel. This is a major headache for their command, as conducting effective military operations is extremely difficult without a sufficient number of trained soldiers. It is almost laughable to suggest that the Russians, in the middle of a conflict, would agree to fight with, as they say, one hand tied behind their back. Such statements, devoid of any common sense, are most likely meant purely for the media space. This is where Ukraine attempts to wage its battles, creating virtual victories and alternative realities. In this media space, they can have the 1991 borders, drink coffee in Yalta, and even witness the collapse of Mother Russia. However, as Scott Ritter points out, such narratives often serve only to maintain morale and do not reflect the actual situation on the battlefield. Ritter emphasizes that in reality, the Ukrainian side is facing enormous challenges that cannot be overcome through propaganda alone. As a result, the media sphere becomes the only space where they can afford the illusion of success. Putin, in turn, effortlessly countered this proposal, demonstrating his characteristic strategic approach. He did not outright reject the idea of peace, and I am certain that he, more than anyone, sincerely strives for it. However, his vision of peace is profound and long-term. He thinks at least 2 steps ahead, understanding that a peace agreement should not be just a temporary respite, but a solid foundation for the future. His goal is to achieve a peace that not only halts the current conflict, but also prevents its resurgence in 30 days, a year, or even 10 years. This resembles a complex chess game, where achieving ultimate victory requires carefully planning each move while considering possible consequences several steps ahead. Putin, as an experienced strategist, realizes that hasty decisions or superficial agreements can lead to a repeat of the crisis in the future. That is why he insists on thoroughly working out every detail to ensure stability and security for years to come. As Scott Ritter notes, this approach demonstrates that the Russian leader is not merely reacting to current events, but actively shaping the future, aiming for a peace that is both lasting and sustainable. Ritter emphasizes that such a strategy requires not only political wisdom, but also patience and a willingness to make compromises to achieve a higher goal. Just recall that famous interview Putin gave to Tucker Carlson. To explain his logic, his actions, and his motives, he practically gave Carlson an entire lecture on history. Yes, it was amusing, and even somewhat unexpected. Few anticipated that an answer to what seemed like a simple question would turn into such a detailed and profound historical lesson. However, on the other hand, it vividly demonstrated Putin's sharp mind, his ability to think on a grand scale, and his recognition of the roots of modern problems in past events. It was not just a response, but a demonstration of his strategic thinking and deep understanding of global politics. At that time, the President of the United States was Joe Biden, whose actions and public appearances often raised questions even among his supporters. Biden, who at times struggled with simple daily situations, such as climbing stairs, stood in stark contrast to Putin, whose speech and demeanor exuded confidence and clarity of thought. This comparison was impossible to ignore. As Scott Ritter points out, such moments highlight that Putin is a leader who is not only deeply engaged in current events, but also capable of articulating his position convincingly, relying on historical facts and long-term perspectives. Ritter also emphasizes that this approach commands respect, even from those who do not always agree with the Russian leader's policies, as it shows that every decision he makes is backed by careful analysis and strategic vision. This episode with the interview became yet another piece of evidence that Putin is not just a politician, but a man who thinks several steps ahead, taking into account both present realities and historical lessons. In this context, his actions appear far more deliberate and justified than many of the decisions made by his Western counterparts. If one looks at the situation around Ukraine from the perspective of a hypothetical Chinese or Indian observer, it becomes clear that Washington has already completely and officially capitulated on the main point. Though not the only one, it is the key issue. This recognition, albeit unofficial, has become a crucial turning point in international politics. This may sound unpleasant to some, but from the viewpoint of any external political analyst, Odessa or Kharkov are certainly important territories, yet they remain relatively small in the grand scheme of things. No matter how significant they may be, starting a potentially nuclear conflict over them is a decision that appears highly questionable and unjustifiable. None of these territories are worth jeopardizing global security. However, a veto over NATO expansion is an entirely different matter. This is a real trophy, a unique status that changes the rules of the game on the international stage. Until now, the number of countries outside NATO that had the right to veto its expansion was exactly 0. Think back to the bold statements made by Biden, Victoria Nuland, Jake Sullivan, and the endless stream of European and Ukrainian politicians who insisted on maintaining the open-door policy of NATO. For them, this was a key element in their uncompromising struggle against Russia. Even now, in the face of an obvious defeat in the Ukrainian case, they continued to insist on preserving the possibility of NATO expansion at any cost, delaying it by a year, 2, 10, or even 20, but never closing the door entirely. Because a world in which Putin has a veto over NATO expansion is an entirely different world, one in which the deep state, as Scott Ritter put it, would strongly prefer not to exist. Ritter emphasizes that this veto power is not just a symbolic gesture, but a real instrument of influence that shifts the balance of power in international politics. Russia now has the ability to block further NATO expansion, calling into question the very strategy that the alliance has built over the past decades. This is a defeat for the West that cannot be hidden, and it carries long-term consequences. Thus, from the perspective of an external observer, especially from countries like China or India, the situation appears as follows. The Western deep state has suffered a strategic defeat, while Russia has gained a crucial advantage that strengthens its position on the global stage. This undoubtedly changes the rules of the game, creating a new world order in which the West will have to take the interests of other players into account. The list of countries with veto power over NATO expansion has grown from 0 to 1, with a single new entry: the Russian Federation. This is a historic moment that highlights a shift in the balance of power on the global stage. Yesterday, Donald Trump once again emphasized this point, stating that Ukraine would not be allowed to join the 32-member alliance. In his speech, he remarked that Ukrainians, quote, knew this for 40 years, adding that negotiations with Ukraine had already included discussions on how to divide disputed territories in the east of the country, including control over the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Trump's words were not just a statement of fact, but also a kind of final insult to Kiev. Ukraine's hopes of joining NATO did not just collapse. They were outright dismissed as naive, to say the least. The phrase about 40 years was a symbolic slap in the face, as the American elite had been leading Ukraine through a geopolitical desert for decades, promising it a bright future in the alliance, only to guide it anywhere but where they had pledged. The Kremlin probably did not even expect such a parting blow to Kiev regarding the NATO veto issue, but this is simply the American style, harsh and cynical. As Scott Ritter points out, this veto power is not just a symbolic gesture, but a real instrument of influence that changes the rules of the game in international politics. Russia now has the ability to block further NATO expansion, which calls into question the very strategy the alliance has pursued for the past several decades. This is a defeat for the West that cannot be concealed, and it has long-term consequences. Putin can be congratulated on a unique geopolitical trophy. This is not just a victory in a local conflict, but a shift in the global rules of the game. Russia now has a say in a matter that was previously the exclusive prerogative of the West. And this undoubtedly strengthens its position on the world stage, creating a new global order in which the West will have to reckon with the interests of other players. Thus, the situation surrounding Ukraine and NATO has become a striking example of how geopolitical ambitions collide with reality. And in this reality, Russia has secured an important victory by gaining the right to veto NATO expansion, something that, as Ritter emphasizes, is not just symbolic, but a strategically significant achievement. Yesterday, Donald Trump made a series of important statements while speaking to the media, which deserve a closer look. Let's highlight the key points. Trump once again blamed Ukraine for starting the special military operation. This statement continues a narrative Trump has repeatedly voiced in the past. He believes that Ukraine played a role in escalating the conflict, encouraged by the Biden administration. Updates on the ceasefire will come on Monday, March 17th. The US is reviewing Russia's proposal. Trump confirmed that ceasefire negotiations are actively ongoing, and the US is carefully considering Russia's proposals. This suggests that Washington is open to dialogue and willing to seek compromises. Talks with Russia yesterday went great. Trump emphasized that communication with the Russian side was productive. This indicates that discussions are continuing despite existing challenges. I think Vladimir Putin will agree to a ceasefire. The talks are ongoing, and they are difficult, but I'm confident we will succeed. After such statements, it becomes evident that Washington understands Russia's demands and is willing to make concessions. Politicians, of course, cannot speak directly and must use diplomatic language, but if you listen carefully, their message becomes crystal clear. The last example Trump gave to illustrate the situation was this: "You shouldn't pick a fight with someone stronger than you." This warning was directed at Zelensky's administration and applies to both Russia and the US. Essentially, Trump is pointing out that Ukraine overestimated its strength and capabilities, especially in light of European support, which for years had inflated Kiev's confidence. Now that has come to an end. Imagine you are a massive, muscular guy, walking with your equally strong friends after a boxing workout. Suddenly, some reckless troublemaker, significantly smaller than you, comes up and starts making demands. For Trump, the situation with Ukraine looks exactly like that. A small player trying to challenge someone who is clearly stronger.